The ancient grandfather clock in the hallway struck 3 in the morning, its somber chime echoing through the silent house. Outside, a winter storm unleashed its fury on Detroit, transforming the city into a frozen wasteland. Snow piled against windows and door frames, wind howled through cracks in the aging structure, and temperatures plummeted far below freezing. Sarah Miller stood at her kitchen table, shoulders slumped with exhaustion, counting wrinkled dollar bills for the third time. The result remained unchanged, $7.32. She ran her fingers through her disheveled blonde hair, a nervous habit from childhood that surfaced in moments of desperation. At 32, Sarah looked a decade older than her years. Life had carved deep lines around her blue eyes that once sparkled with optimism, but now reflected only worry. In the corner of the kitchen, her 2-year-old son, Tommy, slept peacefully on a makeshift bed of couch cushions and blankets, blissfully unaware of their dire situation. The heater in his bedroom had broken 2 weeks ago, and she couldn't afford repairs. The kitchen, with its ancient gas stove running through the night, offered the only warmth in their small house at the end of Maple Street. "What am I going to do?" Sarah whispered to the empty room. Her breath formed visible clouds in the cold air. The house sat isolated at the far end of Maple Street in Detroit, separated from other homes by an empty lot that developers avoided. The wealthier families down the street rarely acknowledged her existence, and when they did, it was with suspicious glances and hushed conversations that stopped when she approached. 8 months ago, her husband Greg had walked out claiming he needed to find himself. He found himself living with a 23-year-old waitress in Tennessee, completely ignoring the child support payments that were supposed to help keep his son fed and housed. The divorce papers sat in a folder on top of the refrigerator, the red stamp marks resembling bloodstains to Sarah's exhausted eyes. Her phone vibrated against the wooden table. A text message from her manager at the cleaning company glowed on the cracked screen. "Don't bother coming in tomorrow. We're letting you go. Your kid was crying too much during your shift yesterday. Customers complained." Sarah stared at the message, reading it repeatedly, hoping the words might somehow rearrange themselves into something less devastating. That was the third job she'd lost in 2 months. The laundromat had fired her when Tommy got sick, and she had to bring him to work. The diner let her go when she fell asleep during her shift after working 18 hours straight across all 3 jobs. "How am I supposed to work if I can't find anyone to watch you, baby?" she said, looking at her sleeping son. Daycare was $200 a week she didn't have. Family help was non-existent, since her father Joseph had died in war before she was born, and her mother had passed away 3 years earlier, taking with her the last person who truly understood Sarah's struggles. Her mother's voice echoed in her memory, stern but loving. "Sarah, honey, remember what I taught you about your father's fried chicken recipe. That secret blend of spices has been in his family for generations. One day when times get tough, that recipe might just save you." At the time, Sarah had smiled and nodded, never imagining she would need salvation from a handful of herbs and spices. But now, sitting in her cold kitchen with her last $7, her father's words felt like a lifeline thrown to a drowning woman. She walked to the old wooden cabinet where she kept her father's recipe box. The index cards inside were yellowed with age, covered in her mother's careful handwriting, preserving the recipes her father had created before going to war. The fried chicken recipe was there, along with detailed instructions for sides and sauces that made her mouth water just reading them. Sarah traced her finger over the faded handwriting. "Maybe it's time to try again," she said to herself, though doubt immediately crept into her voice. The next morning, Sarah used her last $7 to buy chicken and basic ingredients. She set up 2 folding tables in her living room, creating a makeshift dining area next to her tiny kitchen. She made a handwritten menu on poster board and propped it against the front window. "Sarah's Kitchen," it read in careful letters, "authentic Southern cooking, made with love." Tommy sat in his high chair, babbling happily as the smell of perfectly seasoned fried chicken filled the house. The secret was in the blend of spices. Her father had created a combination that made the coating crispy and flavorful, in a way that made people close their eyes and sigh with satisfaction. But as the hours passed, reality set in. She watched through her window as people walked by on their way to the bus stop. Some slowed down when they saw the menu in her window, but when they saw her face through the glass, they quickened their pace and looked away. Martha Wilson from 3 houses down actually stopped and read the menu completely. Sarah felt her heart jump with hope and rushed to open the door. "Good morning, Mrs. Wilson. Would you like to try some of my fried chicken? It's made from my father's recipe. Mrs. Wilson's expression changed the moment she saw Sarah. The older woman's eyes narrowed with suspicion and something that looked uncomfortably like disgust. I don't think so, she said, backing away from the door. I heard about you. Single mother, no husband around. Probably running some kind of illegal operation here. I don't eat food from people like that. The words cut deep, but Sarah forced herself to keep smiling. The food is really good, ma'am. I promise it's clean and fresh. I said no, Mrs. Wilson snapped, and you shouldn't be running a business out of your house. This is a decent neighborhood. Keep your kind of trouble to yourself. Sarah watched her neighbor storm away, her chest tight with humiliation and anger. She closed the door and leaned against it, feeling the weight of rejection settle over her like a heavy blanket. By evening, not a single customer had come, and Sarah was faced with the reality that her desperate plan had failed. She put a sleeping Tommy in his makeshift bed in the kitchen and sat at the table fighting back tears. The storm outside had intensified, and the ancient windows rattled against the howling wind. Then she heard it, a knock at the front door. Not a timid, uncertain knock, but a firm, deliberate sound that somehow carried authority even through the wailing storm. Sarah froze. It was almost midnight. No one in their right mind would be out in this weather, certainly no one with good intentions. The knocking came again, more insistent this time. She crept to the window and peered through a gap in the curtains. What she saw made her gasp. Standing in perfect formation on her snow-covered front walkway were at least 25 elderly men in expensive suits and overcoats, their white hair and distinguished faces dusted with snow. They stood straight-backed and dignified, despite the biting cold, like an assembly of retired senators or corporate executives. At the front of the group stood a tall, imposing figure. Even at what must have been 70-plus years, he carried himself with the bearing of someone accustomed to command. His silver hair was immaculately styled, his camel hair overcoat perfectly tailored, and his leather shoes polished to a mirror shine though now partially buried in snow. He raised his hand to knock again, and Sarah noticed his fingers trembling slightly from the cold. The old man turned his head, scanning the dark windows of her home, and for a moment his eyes seemed to meet hers through the glass. His expression was not threatening, but carried a strange mixture of authority and vulnerability. The porch light illuminated his face, revealing features that seemed somehow familiar to Sarah, though she couldn't place where she might have seen him before. Deep lines etched around his eyes spoke of both laughter and hardship, and there was something in his gaze that reminded her of old photographs of her father. Fear battled with curiosity inside Sarah's chest. The rational part of her brain screamed danger, but another part, perhaps the part that had inherited her father's courage, urged her forward. She glanced back at Tommy, still sleeping peacefully in the kitchen, then slowly approached the door. "Who is it?" she called, trying to keep her voice steady. "My name is Vittorio Romano," came the reply, the voice deep and cultured, with just a hint of an Italian accent. "My associates and I find ourselves in need of shelter from this storm. Our cars are stranded half a mile down the road, and we spotted your light. We would be deeply grateful for any assistance you might offer." Sarah's breath caught. Romano. The name sent a chill down her spine that had nothing to do with the freezing temperatures. Everyone in Detroit knew about the Romano family, one of the oldest and most powerful mafia organizations in the Midwest. Their legitimate businesses spread throughout Chicago and Detroit, but rumors of their other activities had circulated for decades. Her mind raced through fragments of news reports she'd read over the years. The Romanos were old school, supposedly adhering to some ancient code of honor, even in their less legal endeavors. Unlike newer criminal organizations, they were said to protect the neighborhoods where they operated, keeping out drugs and violence. "I understand your hesitation, young lady," Vittorio continued when Sarah didn't immediately respond. "I assure you we mean no harm. We are simply elderly gentlemen caught in a storm on Christmas Eve looking for temporary refuge. If you prefer, we can seek shelter elsewhere." The sincerity in his voice gave Sarah pause. She thought about what her father would do in this situation. Joseph Miller had been a military man with a strong moral compass, but also a believer in helping those in need regardless of circumstances. She glanced at Tommy again, thinking of the lesson she would be teaching him, even if he was too young to understand it now. Then she looked at the $7 on the table, all that stood between them and complete destitution. With a deep breath, Sarah unlocked the door and pulled it open. The blast of cold air made her shiver, but she stood her ground, taking in the sight before her. 25 elderly men, all impeccably dressed, all standing respectfully in the snow. Their faces showed various degrees of cold and exhaustion, but each maintained a dignified posture. "Mr. Romano," she said, mustering her courage, "I have a young son sleeping inside. If I let you in, I need your word that you mean us no harm." Vittorio Romano removed his hat and placed it over his heart, a gesture from another era. "You have my word as a man of honor, Miss Sarah Miller," she replied. "And it's Mrs. though my husband isn't in the picture anymore." Something flickered across Vittoria's face at the mention of her last name, an expression too quick to identify, but it gave Sarah an uneasy feeling. Before she could dwell on it, he spoke again. "Mrs. Miller, you have my solemn oath that no harm will come to you or your child under my watch. In fact, I consider it my personal responsibility to ensure your safety from this moment forward." The intensity in his eyes as he made this declaration startled Sarah, but she found herself believing him despite her better judgment. She stepped aside. "Please come in. I don't have much to offer, but at least it's warm." The procession of elderly men filed into her small home with surprising orderliness. Each one nodded respectfully as they passed some murmuring thanks in accented English. They moved with the coordinated precision of men long accustomed to functioning as a unit. The last to enter was a slightly younger man, perhaps in his 60s, who closed the door behind him. "Frank Caruso," he introduced himself quietly. "Don Vittorio's right hand. Thank you for your kindness, Mrs. Miller." Sarah led the unusual group into her living room, suddenly acutely aware of how shabby her furniture looked, how the paint was peeling in the corners, how the carpet was worn thin in high-traffic areas. The men, however, showed no signs of judgment. They arranged themselves around the room with minimal fuss, taking care not to disturb her few possessions. Some remained standing to allow the oldest among them to sit, a courtesy that impressed Sarah. Vittorio Romano stood in the center of the room, removing his expensive overcoat. He surveyed the space with an unreadable expression, his eyes lingering on the makeshift restaurant setup she had created that morning. "You were planning to open a restaurant?" he asked, gesturing toward the folding tables and hand-painted sign. Sarah felt heat rise to her cheeks. "Just trying to make ends meet. I lost my job today." Vittorio nodded thoughtfully. Then his gaze landed on something behind Sarah, and his expression changed dramatically. She turned to follow his line of sight and saw he was staring at a framed photograph on her wall, a picture of her father in his military uniform. "Joseph Miller," Vittorio said softly, his voice filled with an emotion Sarah couldn't identify. "This is your father?" Surprised. Sarah nodded. "Yes, he died in war before I was born. Did you know him?" Vittorio moved toward the photograph with an almost reverent slowness. "Joseph Miller," he repeated, reaching out but stopping just short of touching the frame. "A brave man, a good man." Before Sarah could ask more questions, a small voice called from the kitchen. "Mama." Tommy stood in the doorway, rubbing his eyes sleepily, his small form dwarfed by his dinosaur pajamas. His blonde curls stuck up at odd angles, and his cherubic face showed confusion at the room full of strangers. The atmosphere in the room changed instantly. The elderly men straightened, some smiling gently, others looking away as if to give the child privacy. Vittorio turned from the photograph, and his stern face softened as he looked at the little boy. "This must be your son," he said, his voice gentler than before. He knelt down with surprising agility for a man his age, bringing himself to Tommy's eye level. "Hello, young man. My name is Vittorio. My friends and I got caught in the snow. Your mother was kind enough to let us warm up." Tommy regarded the old man solemnly, then glanced at his mother for reassurance. Sarah moved to his side, placing a protective hand on his shoulder. "It's okay, sweetie. These gentlemen are just visiting for a little while." Tommy studied Vittorio's face, then pointed to his silver hair. "Snow?" he asked innocently. A ripple of gentle laughter moved through the group of elderly men. Vittorio's face broke into a genuine smile, transforming his features from intimidating to grandfatherly in an instant. "No, little one, not snow, just many, many years of living," he replied, then reached into his pocket and pulled out a small candy wrapped in colorful foil. "May I?" he asked Sarah, holding up the treat. Sarah hesitated, then nodded. Vittorio offered the candy to Tommy, who accepted it with a shy smile. "Thank you," the boy said softly, his early manners showing through his shyness. You are very welcome, Vittorio replied. As he rose to his feet, Sarah noticed a flicker of pain cross his features, quickly masked. The old man was clearly suffering from the cold and perhaps arthritis or some other ailment common to his age. Mrs. Miller, Frank said, stepping forward, some of us noticed your kitchen setup. With your permission, we might be able to help prepare a meal for everyone. We have some supplies in our bags, and many of us are quite skilled in the culinary arts. Sarah's professional pride warred with practical necessity. She had very little food to offer 25 guests, but the thought of accepting charity from these men stirred complicated feelings. In the end, pragmatism won out. That would be very kind, she said, though I don't have much to work with. Leave that to us, Frank assured her with a smile that crinkled the corners of his eyes. He gestured to several of the men who produced packages from their expensive overcoats. Packages that turned out to contain various food items as if they had been returning from some gourmet shopping expedition when the storm hit. Sarah led them to her small kitchen, watching in amazement as they efficiently organized themselves. These elderly men in their expensive suits moved with the precision of professional chefs, chopping vegetables, preparing sauces, and arranging plates. Tommy, now fully awake, watched the proceedings with fascination from his high chair. One of the older men, introduced as Angelo, entertained the boy with magic tricks involving disappearing spoons and reappearing napkins. As the impromptu cooking team worked, Sarah found herself next to Vittorio, who had insisted on helping despite his obvious status as the group's leader. You seem very familiar with cooking, Mr. Romano, she observed, watching him expertly slice mushrooms. Please call me Vittorio, he replied. And yes, cooking is a passion of mine. My mother taught me as a boy in Chicago. She believed a man should know how to feed himself and those he cares about. He paused, his knife hovering above the cutting board. Your father had quite a talent for it, as well as I recall, especially his fried chicken. Sarah nearly dropped the bowl she was holding. You really did know my father when, Vittorio continued his methodical slicing. War 1970. Your father and I served together, briefly. He was a remarkable man. He spoke often of his family recipes, said they had been passed down for generations. Sarah's mind reeled with questions. Her mother had told her very little about her father's time in war, only that he had died a hero saving fellow soldiers. I have his fried chicken recipe, she said softly. It's what I was planning to sell today. Vittorio stopped cutting and looked directly at her, his dark eyes intense. Would you consider preparing it tonight? I would very much like to taste it again after all these years. Something in his request felt important, weighted with meaning, beyond simple curiosity or hunger. Sarah nodded, retrieving the recipe card from her father's box. As she began preparing the chicken, according to her father's instructions, the kitchen filled with a familiar aroma that always made her feel closer to the father she had never known. The elderly men worked around her respectfully, some occasionally glancing at her technique with approving nods. Frank approached her as she was coating the chicken pieces in the secret spice mixture. Don Vittorio rarely asked for anything for himself, he said quietly. The fact that he requested your father's chicken, it means something significant to him. Sarah looked over at Vittorio, who was now sitting at her small kitchen table, watching her work with an expression that seemed almost reverent. Don Vittorio seems to be more than just your boss, she ventured, keeping her voice low. Frank smiled slightly. To all of us, he is family. A father figure, a mentor, a protector. The Romano family takes care of its own Mrs. Miller. It's a bond that goes beyond business. An hour later, Sarah's small home had been transformed. The folding tables were covered with proper tablecloths produced from someone's luggage, set with surprisingly elegant dinnerware that had appeared as if by magic. Candles glowed on every surface, creating a warm, intimate atmosphere that made the peeling paint and worn furniture fade into the background. Tommy had been given a place of honor next to Vittorio, seated on a cushion that elevated him to proper dining height. The elderly men treated the little boy with a mixture of amusement and respect that made Sarah's heart swell with unexpected emotion. When she brought out the platter of her father's fried chicken, a hush fell over the room. Vittorio stared at the golden brown pieces as if seeing a ghost. When Sarah served him the first portion, his hand trembled slightly as he accepted the plate. The room remained silent as Vittorio took his first bite. His eyes closed, and for a moment Sarah worried he didn't like it. Then she saw something extraordinary. A single tear tracked down the weathered cheek of this powerful, intimidating man. He opened his eyes and looked at Sarah with an expression of profound emotion. "Exactly as I remember," he said, his voice husky. "Your father made this for our unit the night before." He stopped composing himself. It was the best meal many of us ever had in that godforsaken place. One by one, the other men tasted the chicken, and the reactions were similar. Some nodded silently, others murmured appreciatively, a few touched their hearts in a gesture that needed no translation. These tough elderly men were transported back to another time, another place connected by the simple flavors of Sarah's father's recipe. As the meal progressed, the atmosphere relaxed. Stories flowed as freely as the wine someone had produced from a bag. Tales of old Chicago, of family traditions, of challenges overcome, and lessons learned. Tommy eventually fell asleep in Vittorio's lap, the old man unconsciously stroking the boy's hair as he spoke. Sarah listened, fascinated by these glimpses into a world so different from her own. The men spoke of honor, loyalty, and family as sacred values woven through anecdotes that carefully avoided any mention of illegal activities. As the night grew later, Vittorio gently handed the sleeping Tommy to Sarah. "You have a fine boy there, Mrs. Miller. He has his grandfather's eyes." Sarah looked down at her son's peaceful face. "I wish my father could have known him." "Believe me," Vittorio said with conviction, "he would have been enormously proud of both of you." As she tucked Tommy back into his bed in the kitchen, Sarah could hear the men organizing sleeping arrangements in her living room. They insisted she and Tommy take the bedroom while they would make do with the limited space available to them. When she returned to the living room, Vittoria was standing by the photograph of her father again, studying it intently. "Mr. Romano," she said, approaching him cautiously, "how exactly did you know my father? You said you served together, but—" Vittorio turned to her, his expression solemn. "Your father saved my life, Mrs. Miller, and the lives of several others in our unit. He threw himself on a grenade that would have killed us all." He gestured to the men around the room. "Many of us here today owe our lives to Joseph Miller's sacrifice." Sarah felt her knees weaken, and Vittorio gently guided her to a chair. "I was never told exactly how he died," she whispered. "My mother only said he was a hero." "The greatest kind," Vittorio confirmed, "the kind who gives everything for others without hesitation." He knelt beside her chair, wincing slightly at the movement. "Mrs. Miller, before your father died, he extracted a promise from me. He asked me to look after his family if I ever had the chance." His eyes filled with regret. "I tried to find your mother after the war, but she had moved, changed her name after remarrying. I failed to keep my promise for all these years." Sarah stared at him, trying to process this revelation. "Until tonight," she said finally. "Until my father's chicken recipe brought you to my door in the middle of a snowstorm." Vittorio nodded, a faint smile touching his lips. "Some might call it fate. I call it Joseph still looking out for his family." He reached into his pocket and withdrew a business card, pressing it into her hand. "The storm will pass by morning and we will be on our way. But I want you to have this. My personal number. If you ever need anything day or night, you call. The Romano family pays its debts, Mrs. Miller. And we owe your father a debt that can never truly be repaid." Sarah looked down at the elegant card with its simple embossed text, then back at Vittorio's earnest expression. In his aged face, she could see traces of the young soldier her father had saved, the man who had carried the weight of an unpaid promise for decades. "Thank you," she said simply, tucking the card carefully into her pocket. As she retired to her bedroom, leaving the elderly men to settle in for the night, Sarah felt something she hadn't experienced in months: hope. Not just from the promise of help, though that was certainly welcome, but from the connection to her father that had been given back to her tonight. She drifted to sleep, listening to the gentle murmur of voices from the living room, the storm still raging outside but somehow less threatening now. Her last conscious thought was that her father's recipe had indeed saved her, just not in the way her mother had meant. In the early hours before dawn, as Sarah and Tommy slept peacefully, Vittorio Romano stood at the window watching the falling snow. Frank approached silently, standing beside his longtime friend and mentor. "She doesn't know everything, does she?" Frank asked quietly. Vittorio shook his head. "She knows her father was a hero. That's enough for now. And the boy," Vittorio's gaze remained fixed on the swirling snow. "Joseph Miller's grandson. He has the same look in his eyes." His voice softened. "We will watch over them, Frank. From this day forward, they are family." Frank nodded, understanding the full weight of that declaration. In the Romano family, such promises were sacred. As the first light of Christmas morning began to push back the darkness, Vittorio returned to the photograph of Joseph Miller, offering a silent prayer for the man who had given him 45 years of life he would otherwise never have had. The debt would begin to be repaid today, and the Romano family always honored its debts. Little did Sarah know, as she slept peacefully in the next room, that by morning she would face a crisis that would bring not just Vittorio and his 24 companions back to her door, but an army of 1,500 loyal Romano family members, changing her life and her community forever. 3 days passed since the night of the snowstorm. The elderly Mafia members had departed with the morning light, leaving Sarah's house tidier than they found it. Vittorio Romano had pressed her hand firmly before leaving, repeating his instruction to call if she ever needed anything. Sarah had nodded politely, tucking his business card into her pocket, not truly believing she would need to use it. The snow continued to fall intermittently, transforming Detroit into a crystalline wonderland that concealed the city's scars beneath pristine white. Schools remained closed, businesses operated with skeleton crews, and the roads were treacherous ribbons of ice and slush. The temperature had plummeted further, breaking records across Michigan. At first, Tommy had been disappointed to see his new friends leave, repeatedly asking for Vito throughout that first day. By the second day, however, his questions had ceased, replaced by an unusual quietness that worried Sarah. By the third night, she understood why. The ancient clock in the hallway struck midnight, its chimes echoing through the silent house. Sarah sat beside Tommy's makeshift bed in the kitchen, gently stroking his forehead. Heat radiated from his skin like a furnace. His small chest rose and fell with rapid, shallow breaths, and his cherubic face had taken on an alarming pallor beneath the fever's flush. "Tommy, baby, can you open your eyes for Mommy?" Sarah whispered, trying to keep the panic from her voice. Tommy's eyelids fluttered, but didn't open. A small, pitiful moan escaped his lips, breaking Sarah's heart. She had been giving him children's fever reducer for hours, but his temperature continued to climb. The kitchen thermometer showed 104 degrees, well into the danger zone. Sarah glanced at her phone. No signal. The storm had damaged cell towers across the region. The landline had been disconnected months ago when she couldn't afford to pay the bill. She had no car to take Tommy to the hospital, no neighbors who would help, and no way to call an ambulance. Desperation clawed at her chest as she watched her son struggle for breath. The sound had a wet, crackling quality that she recognized from her mother's final illness: pneumonia. In an adult, it was dangerous. In a small child, it could be fatal within hours. Sarah rummaged frantically through her pockets until she found it. The elegant business card, slightly bent at the corners from being carried for 3 days. Vittorio Romano's personal number. She stared at the card, weighing her options. There were none. Tommy needed help immediately, and this was her only lifeline. Sarah ran to the neighbor's house, pounding on Martha Wilson's door until the porch light flicked on. The older woman opened the door a crack, her face twisted with irritation. "What on earth are you doing? Do you know what time it is?" "Please," Sarah gasped, the cold air burning her lungs. "My son is very sick. I need to use your phone. It's an emergency." Martha's expression wavered between annoyance and concern. Finally, humanity won out, and she opened the door wider. "Make it quick," she said, pointing to the telephone on the wall, "and don't touch anything else." Sarah's fingers trembled as she dialed the number from the card. 1 ring, 2 rings, 3. Her heart sank with each unanswered tone. It was midnight on a weekday. Of course, an elderly man wouldn't be awake to answer. Then a click. Vittorio Romano. The voice was alert, showing no signs of having been awakened. "Mr. Romano, this is Sarah Miller," she said, her voice breaking. "From the snowstorm. I'm sorry to call so late, but my son Tommy is very sick. I think it's pneumonia. I have no way to get him to a hospital." The line went silent for a moment, and Sarah feared the connection had been lost. Then Vittorio spoke, his voice calm but carrying an unmistakable undercurrent of command. "Go back to your son. Keep him warm. We will be there soon." "Thank you," Sarah managed to say before the line went dead. Martha Wilson stood nearby, arms crossed over her bathrobe. "Who on earth was that? And what do you mean, pneumonia? Have you been neglecting that child?" Sarah ignored the accusation, already heading for the door. Thank you for letting me use your phone, she said, hurrying back into the night, leaving Martha standing bewildered in her doorway. Back in her kitchen, Sarah wrapped Tommy in every blanket she could find. His breathing had become more labored, each inhale a struggle that made his little chest heave. She held him close, whispering reassurances she wasn't sure he could hear. Help is coming, baby. Just hold on. Please hold on. She had no idea what form that help might take or how long it would be in coming. She only knew that the conviction in Vittorio Romano's voice had given her the first glimmer of hope since Tommy's fever had spiked. 30 minutes passed like an eternity. The only sounds in the house were Tommy's ragged breathing and Sarah's whispered prayers. Then she heard it, a distant rumble growing steadily louder. Not the sound of a single vehicle, but many. Dozens, perhaps hundreds. Sarah moved to the window Tommy cradled against her chest. What she saw made her gasp. The entire street was filled with headlights, a river of vehicles stretching as far as she could see. Luxury cars, SUVs, vintage automobiles, all moving in perfect formation toward her house. As they drew closer, she could see that every vehicle was occupied by elderly men in formal attire as if they had been attending an opera or gala dinner. The lead car, a gleaming black Mercedes, stopped directly in front of her house. Vittorio Romano emerged impeccably dressed, despite the hour, followed by Frank and several other men she recognized from the snowstorm night. Behind them, car doors opened all along Maple Street, releasing what appeared to be hundreds of elderly gentlemen into the snowy night. Lights flicked on in neighboring houses as residents were awakened by the unprecedented procession. Faces appeared in windows, some curious, others alarmed. Sarah saw Martha Wilson on her front porch, mouth agape at the spectacle unfolding before her. Vittorio strode purposefully towards Sarah's door, flanked by a distinguished elderly man carrying a medical bag. Before they reached the porch, the door flew open as Sarah rushed to meet them, Tommy limp in her arms. "He's getting worse," she said, not bothering with greetings. "He's burning up, and his breathing doesn't sound right." Vittorio nodded to the man beside him. "This is Dr. Anthony Lorenzo. He was chief of pediatrics at Chicago Memorial for 30 years before his retirement. He will help your son." Dr. Lorenzo stepped forward, his movements brisk despite his age. "Let's get him inside and take a look at him," he said, his voice carrying the quiet authority of decades in medicine. "Try to stay calm, Mrs. Miller. Children are remarkably resilient." As they entered the house, Sarah became aware of the activity outside. Dozens of elderly men were unloading equipment from their vehicles. Medical devices, portable generators, supplies of all kinds were being efficiently transported toward her home by men who looked more suited to boardrooms than manual labor. Inside, Dr. Lorenzo had taken charge of her kitchen, transforming it into a makeshift examination room with practiced efficiency. He listened to Tommy's chest with a stethoscope, took his temperature with an advanced digital thermometer, and checked his oxygen levels with a small device clipped to his finger. "Pneumonia, as you suspected," he confirmed, his expression grave but professional. "His oxygen saturation is too low. We need to start him on antibiotics immediately, provide respiratory support, and get this fever down." As if conjured by his words, two more elderly men entered, carrying portable medical equipment that Sarah recognized as oxygen tanks and IV stands from her mother's hospice care. "Where did all this come from?" she asked, watching in amazement as her humble kitchen transformed into a high-tech medical facility. "The Romano family has extensive medical resources," Frank explained, standing nearby. "Many of our members are retired healthcare professionals. We maintain equipment for emergencies." Sarah didn't have time to ponder the implications of a Mafia family keeping hospital-grade medical equipment on hand. Her focus remained entirely on Tommy as Dr. Lorenzo inserted an IV line into his tiny arm with gentle expertise. "He needs specific antibiotics," the doctor said, looking up at Vittorio. "The weather has closed most pharmacies, and he needs them now, not in the morning." Vittorio nodded and turned to Frank. "Call Stanley Weinberg. His pharmacy is on Jefferson Avenue. Get him to open up and prepare the medications on the list Dr. Lorenzo will give you." Frank nodded and stepped outside to make the call. Sarah watched through the window as he spoke to a group of men who immediately departed in several vehicles moving with military precision. The scene outside her house had grown even more extraordinary. What looked like hundreds of elderly men in expensive overcoats were systematically organizing themselves in the snowy street. Some directed traffic, others set up portable heaters on her front lawn, and still others established what appeared to be a command center in a large black SUV. Neighbors had emerged from their homes, clustering in small groups and watching the proceedings, with expressions ranging from alarm to fascination. Sarah spotted Martha Wilson in her bathrobe arguing with a tall, elderly gentleman who responded with old-world courtesy that seemed to confuse and frustrate the woman. Inside the house, De Lorenzo was explaining Tommy's condition to Sarah. The infection has settled deep in his lungs. The antibiotics will help, but they take time to work. His oxygen levels are concerning. If they drop any lower, he may need to be hospitalized. The nearest hospital is Detroit General, Sarah said, anxiety tightening her chest. It's at least 20 minutes away in good weather. With the roads like this, we're monitoring him closely, Dr. Lorenzo assured her. We have equipment here to provide the same level of care he would receive in a hospital emergency room. If his condition worsens, we have contingency plans. As if to emphasize the seriousness of the situation, Tommy's breathing suddenly became more labored, each intake of air a visible struggle that made his small body shake with effort. His oxygen saturation is dropping. Dr. Lorenzo announced, his calm professionalism giving way to urgency. We need to establish better respiratory support immediately. Vittorio, who had been standing silently in the corner of the kitchen, stepped forward. What do you need, doctor? He needs respiratory therapy and more intensive treatment than we can provide here. He needs to be in a pediatric ICU. Vittorio nodded once and turned to Sarah. We're taking him to the hospital. Now. The next few minutes passed in a blur of activity. Tommy was carefully wrapped in thermal blankets. Lorenzo continued to administer oxygen while monitoring his vital signs. Outside, the formation of vehicles parted like the Red Sea, creating a clear path down the center of Maple Street. A vehicle that Sarah recognized as a medical transport van pulled up directly to her front door. Inside, it was equipped like a miniature ambulance with monitoring equipment and a secure transport stretcher sized for a child. How did you get all this here so quickly? Sarah asked, as Tommy was gently transferred to the stretcher. The Romano family takes care of its own, Vittorio said simply. And as I told you, we owe your father a debt that can never truly be repaid. As they prepared to move Tommy to the vehicle, flashing lights appeared at the end of the street. Police cars. At least 3 of them moving cautiously through the crowd of luxury vehicles and elderly men. Sarah felt panic rise in her throat. Would the police disrupt Tommy's transport? Would they delay getting him to the hospital? With questions about this unusual gathering, Vittorio seemed unconcerned. He watched calmly as the lead police cruiser stopped and a tall officer in his 50s emerged. The man approached with a hand resting cautiously on his holster, surveying the scene with professional wariness. Chief Michaels, Vittorio greeted him with a respectful nod. Thank you for coming so promptly. The police chief's expression registered surprise at being addressed by name. He studied Vittorio's face, recognition slowly dawning in his eyes. Colonel Romano, he asked, his hand dropping away from his weapon. Is that you, Tom? Vittorio smiled slightly. It's been a long time, Sergeant. Or rather, Chief now, I see. Congratulations on your promotion. Chief Michaels shook his head in disbelief. It's been what? 30 years. What in God's name is happening here? We got calls about a massive gathering, possible criminal activity. Nothing so dramatic, Vittorio replied smoothly. A medical emergency involving a child. The grandson of a mutual friend, actually. Joseph Miller. You remember him from our tour? The police chief's expression shifted from confusion to something approaching reverence. Miller, of course, I remember. He saved half our platoon. His gaze moved to Sarah, who stood nearby, confusion evident on her face. This is his daughter, Vittorio nodded, and that, he said, indicating the stretcher being loaded into the medical transport, is his grandson, Pneumonia. We're transporting him to Detroit General. Chief Michaels straightened his demeanor, shifting from suspicious law enforcement to concerned veteran. What do you need from us, Colonel? An escort would be helpful. The roads are treacherous and time is of the essence. Without hesitation, Chief Michaels turned to his officers and began issuing orders. Within moments, the police cruisers had repositioned themselves to lead and follow the medical transport. As Tommy was secured inside the vehicle, Sarah found herself face to face with the police chief. Your father was a great man, Mrs. Miller, he said, his voice gruff with emotion. I wouldn't be here today if not for him. We'll get your boy to the hospital safely, I promise you that. Sarah nodded, too overwhelmed to speak. She climbed into the transport beside Tommy. Dr. Lorenzo, already inside monitoring the equipment. Vittorio joined them, moving with surprising agility for a man his age. As the doors closed, Sarah caught a glimpse of her neighborhood transformed. Hundreds of elderly men in formal attire stood respectfully as the vehicle prepared to depart. Neighbors watched from their porches, their expressions no longer suspicious, but confused and curious. Martha Wilson stood with her hand over her heart, her earlier hostility replaced by something that looked almost like shame. The journey to Detroit General Hospital was a surreal procession through the snow-covered city. Police cruisers led the way, sirens clearing their path. Behind the medical transport, a convoy of black luxury vehicles followed in perfect formation. At intersections, Sarah glimpsed elderly men in suits, directing traffic, having arrived ahead of them, somehow to ensure their passage remained unobstructed. Inside the transport, Dr. Lorenzo worked continuously, adjusting oxygen flow, checking vital signs, administering medications through Tommy's IV. Vittorio sat opposite Sarah, his expression grave but composed. "Why are you doing all this?" Sarah finally asked, her voice barely above a whisper. "I understand you knew my father, but this is extraordinary." Vittorio regarded her for a long moment before speaking. "Your father saved my life and the lives of many men who are here tonight. In our final conversation as he lay dying from his wounds, he made me promise something." He paused, emotion briefly overwhelming his customary composure. "He made me promise that if I ever encountered his family, I would protect them as he had protected me. It was the last request of a dying man, a sacred oath that I have carried for decades." His eyes met Sarah's, their intensity undiminished by age. "I failed to find your mother after the war, but now, by what some might call divine providence, I have found you and Tommy. I will not fail Joseph Miller again." The conviction in his voice left no room for doubt. Sarah realized she was witnessing something beyond ordinary human commitment. This was an old-world code of honor, a blood oath that transcended time and circumstance. The transport slowed as they approached the hospital emergency entrance. Sarah was surprised to see the area already organized with medical personnel standing ready. A pediatric team waited with the gurney seated for a small child. "How did they know we were coming?" she asked. Frank, who had been riding in the front of the transport, glanced back. Don Vittorio called ahead. "The hospital administrator is an old friend." Sarah was beginning to understand that old friend, in the context of the Romano family, meant something quite different than it did in ordinary circles. The transition from transport to hospital was seamless. Tommy was transferred to the waiting gurney and immediately whisked inside Dr. Lorenzo, accompanying him and briefing the pediatric team as they moved. Sarah hurried alongside Vittorio and Frank, following at a respectful distance. The emergency department was surprisingly well-staffed despite the late hour and treacherous weather. Doctors and nurses moved with practiced efficiency, continuing the treatment Dr. Lorenzo had begun while adding hospital resources. As Tommy was settled into a treatment room, a distinguished doctor in his 60s approached Vittorio with a deferential nod. "Don Romano, we've prepared the private pediatric suite as requested. The specialist is standing by." "Thank you, Richard," Vittorio replied. "This child receives the same care you would give your own grandson. Is that understood?" "Absolutely, Don Romano. The very best we can provide." Sarah watched this exchange with a mixture of gratitude and unease. The power Vittorio wielded was evident in every interaction, every smoothly executed arrangement. It was clear that his influence extended far beyond what she had imagined, reaching into institutions she had always considered immune to outside pressure. As Tommy was stabilized and prepared for transfer to the pediatric intensive care unit, Sarah found herself momentarily alone with Vittorio in the hallway outside the treatment room. "Mr. Romano, she began hesitantly. "I don't know how to thank you for what you've done tonight. You may have saved Tommy's life, but I have to ask, what happens now?" "After Tommy recovers." Vittorio studied her with those penetrating eyes that seemed to evaluate not just her words but the character behind them. "Now, Sarah Miller, we fulfill the promise I made to your father. We ensure that you and Tommy never again find yourselves without resources or protection." He straightened his immaculate suit jacket, a gesture that seemed to belong to boardrooms rather than hospital corridors. "When Tommy is stronger, we will discuss the future. A future where the grandson of Joseph Miller never wants for anything, where his mother never again counts pennies at her kitchen table in the middle of the night." Before Sarah could respond, a commotion erupted at the emergency department entrance. Raised voices echoed down the hallway. followed by the appearance of a tall man in an expensive suit flanked by two younger men with the unmistakable bearing of law enforcement. Vittorio's posture shifted subtly, a change almost imperceptible to anyone not watching closely. Frank materialized beside him, his hand slipping inside his overcoat in a movement that made Sarah suddenly very nervous. The newcomer spotted Vittorio and strode directly toward him, his expression a mixture of determination and wariness. "Don Vittorio Romano," he said, his voice carrying the unmistakable authority of federal law enforcement. "I'm Special Agent Daniel Roberts, FBI. I believe we need to have a conversation about tonight's activities." Vittorio regarded the FBI agent with the calm assessment of a man who had faced far more intimidating adversaries. "Agent Roberts, I understand you have questions, but as you can see, we are in the midst of a medical emergency involving a child." Roberts glanced at Sarah, then through the window of the treatment room where medical staff continued to work on Tommy. His stern expression softened slightly. "I've been tracking your movements for 3 years, Don Romano," he said, lowering his voice. "Never seen anything quite like tonight's mobilization. Half the Bureau is convinced you're planning something big. Instead, I find you in a hospital with a sick kid." He shook his head, genuine confusion evident in his features. "Mind telling me what's going on?" Vittorio considered the agent for a moment, then made a decision. "The child is the grandson of Joseph Miller, a soldier who saved my life in the war. I made a promise to a dying man. Tonight I honored that promise." Something shifted in the agent's expression. "Miller from the Alpha Company ambush in 70. Vittorio's eyebrows rose slightly. "You know the name?" Roberts nodded slowly. "Different unit, but he knew the story. Said Miller threw himself on a grenade, saved his whole squad." His gaze moved to Sarah. "This is his daughter." "Yes," Vittorio confirmed. "And that," he indicated the treatment room, "is his grandson." The FBI agent stood silently for a moment, internal conflict playing across his features. Finally, he spoke. "Don Romano, your activities tonight crossed several jurisdictional boundaries and involved the mobilization of known associates of the Romano family in numbers that triggered multiple alerts in our system." He paused, seeming to choose his next words carefully. "However, given the circumstances and the medical emergency involved, I'm willing to postpone our discussion until the child's condition is stabilized." Vittorio inclined his head graciously. "A reasonable accommodation, Agent Roberts. Perhaps you would care to join us? I suspect we have stories to share about our respective fathers' service." The unexpected invitation caught Roberts off guard. After a moment's hesitation, he nodded. "I'd like that, actually. My father rarely spoke about the war, but when he did, it was often about the men who served with honor, regardless of what paths they took after the war." As Tommy was transferred to the pediatric ICU, an unlikely group assembled in the private waiting area Vittorio had arranged. Sarah sat near the window watching the snow continue to fall over Detroit. Beside her, Vittorio and Agent Roberts engaged in quiet conversation, occasionally nodding or gesturing as they shared memories passed down from their fathers. Frank coordinated with the ever-present Romano family members who had somehow managed to establish a comfortable base of operations within the hospital. Nurses and doctors moved through the area with a deference that spoke volumes about Vittorio's influence. Outside in the parking lot, the convoy of luxury vehicles remained their elderly occupants, standing vigil despite the cold and late hour. Some had found their way to the hospital cafeteria where they charmed the staff with old-world manners and generous tips. Sarah watched this strange confluence of worlds with a sense of wonder. 24 hours ago, she had been a desperate single mother with no options and no hope. Now she sat at the center of a mobilization that involved hundreds of people, from Mafia elders to federal agents, all somehow united by her father's long-ago act of heroism. As dawn broke over Detroit, Dr. Lorenzo emerged from Tommy's room with the first genuinely positive news of the night. "His fever is coming down and his oxygen levels are stabilizing," he announced. "The antibiotics are working. He's not out of danger yet, but he's responding to treatment." Sarah felt tears of relief flood her eyes. She looked up at the unlikely guardian angels who had materialized in her darkest hour. Vittorio Romano Don, of one of the most powerful mafia families in America. Frank Caruso, his loyal consigliere. Agent Daniel Roberts, the FBI agent who had set aside his investigation to honor a shared connection to the war. In that moment, surrounded by men whose lives had been shaped by her father's sacrifice, Sarah finally understood the true meaning of family. It wasn't always defined by blood or law. Sometimes it was formed in the crucible of shared experience of promises kept across decades of honor that transcended conventional boundaries. Tommy would recover. And when he did, she knew with absolute certainty that the world awaiting him would be vastly different from the one they had known just days before. The Romano family had entered their lives bringing with them a complex legacy of obligation, protection, and opportunity that would forever alter their path. As the sun rose higher, illuminating the snow-covered city with golden light, Vittorio stood beside Sarah at the window, his expression contemplative. "Your father saved my life when I was not much older than you are now," he said quietly. "He gave me 50 years I would not have had otherwise. Time to build a family, a legacy, a life of meaning." He turned to face her, his eyes reflecting decades of accumulated wisdom. "Now it is my turn to ensure that his daughter and grandson have the same opportunity." Sarah realized she stood at a crossroads. Behind her lay a life of struggle and isolation. Ahead, a future intertwined with a family whose power and methods existed in moral territory she had never navigated. "What exactly are you offering, Mr. Romano?" she asked, needing clarity before taking another step. Vittorio smiled, the expression transforming his austere features. "A future Mrs. Miller, for you and for Tommy. A business of your own based on your father's remarkable recipes. A community that protects its own. An extended family that never forgets its obligations." His voice took on a gentle quality rarely heard by those outside his inner circle. "And perhaps most importantly, the truth about who your father really was, beyond the heroism of his final moments." Outside the window, the city of Detroit continued to awaken, unaware that in this quiet hospital room, a legacy was being reclaimed, a promise fulfilled, and a new chapter beginning in a story that had started 50 years earlier in the jungles of war. Tommy's recovery would mark only the beginning of an extraordinary transformation that would eventually extend far beyond one small family to encompass an entire community. But that was a story still waiting to unfold, with challenges, revelations, and unexpected alliances yet to come. 3 days after Tommy's admission to Detroit General Hospital, the doctors pronounced him well enough to return home. His young body had responded remarkably to the aggressive treatment, his fever subsiding and his lungs gradually clearing. Throughout his recovery, the hospital staff had treated the small family with extraordinary attention, a fact not lost on Sarah. She had watched specialists appear at all hours, nurses check on Tommy with clockwork regularity, and hospital administrators personally inquire after his comfort. She knew who to thank for this exceptional care. Don Vittorio Romano had remained a constant presence, sometimes sitting quietly in Tommy's room for hours reading Italian fairy tales to the drowsy child, or simply watching over him while Sarah caught moments of much-needed rest. The elderly man moved with the deliberate dignity of someone accustomed to command, yet showed a surprising gentleness when interacting with Tommy. On the morning of their departure, Sarah found herself facing an unexpected dilemma. Her house, while technically habitable, remained cold with its broken heating system. The ancient windows leaked frigid air, and the kitchen where Tommy had previously slept was hardly ideal for a child recovering from severe pneumonia. As she contemplated this problem, standing in the hospital corridor, with a small bag containing their meager belongings, Vittorio approached with Frank at his side. "Mrs. Miller," Vittorio said, his formal manner unchanged despite the days of shared vigil, "I hope you will allow us to present a proposal regarding your return home." Sarah had learned enough about the Romano family to recognize that a proposal from Don Vittorio was rarely declined, yet his tone suggested genuine choice rather than coercion. "Of course," she replied, shifting Tommy's weight in her arms. The boy was still weak, his head resting trustingly against her shoulder. Vittorio gestured toward a private consultation room, and Sarah followed, noting the two Romano associates who discreetly positioned themselves outside the door once it closed. The hospital had maintained an unusual security presence throughout their stay, with elderly men in expensive suits stationed at strategic points throughout the pediatric floor. She had initially found it unnerving, but had gradually come to accept it as part of the Romano protection. Inside the room, Vittorio waited for Sarah to sit before taking a seat himself, a courtesy from another era. Frank remained standing near the door, ever the vigilant second in command. "During Tommy's illness," Vittorio began, "I took the liberty of having some associates examine your home. The heating system requires complete replacement. The insulation is inadequate. The windows leak cold air. His expression revealed no judgment, merely stating facts. These conditions are not conducive to Tommy's recovery. Sarah felt a flush of shame. She had done her best with limited resources, but hearing her home's deficiencies cataloged so precisely made her acutely aware of how she had failed to provide properly for Tommy. I know it's not ideal, she said, her voice tight, but it's what we have. Vittorio raised a hand, a gesture both reassuring and commanding. Please understand, I am not criticizing. Rather, I am explaining why we have taken certain actions. Sarah tensed. What actions? For the past 3 days, a team has been renovating your home. New heating system, new windows, proper insulation, a complete remodeling of the kitchen, a dedicated bedroom for Tommy with appropriate furniture. Sarah stared at him, struggling to process this information. You've been renovating my house without asking me. An emergency measure, Vittorio replied smoothly. Given Tommy's condition, waiting for approval seemed ill-advised. However, if our actions have offended you, I offer my sincere apologies. The apology, delivered with genuine dignity, caught Sarah off guard. This powerful man, who clearly orchestrated events on a scale she could hardly comprehend, was apologizing to her. I'm not offended, she said slowly. I'm just overwhelmed. Mr. Romano, I can't possibly afford to repay you for renovations like that. Vittorio's expression shifted subtly, a fleeting shadow crossing his features. Mrs. Miller, allow me to be clear. There is no debt. What has been done for you and Tommy is but a fraction of what I owe your father. Had Joseph Miller not sacrificed himself, I would have died 50 years ago. Every day since has been a gift purchased with his blood. His voice, usually controlled, carried an undercurrent of emotion. If anything, I remain forever in debt to your family. Tommy stirred in Sarah's arms, his eyes fluttering open. He looked around the room with the drowsy confusion of a child emerging from sleep. Then his gaze settled on Vittorio. A smile transformed his tired face. Grandpa Vito, he murmured, reaching one small hand toward the elderly man. Sarah caught her breath at the unexpected title. During Tommy's fevered days in the hospital, Vittorio had spent countless hours at his bedside. Clearly, in the child's mind, a connection had formed that transcended their brief acquaintance. Vittorio's reaction was equally revealing. For a moment, his carefully maintained composure cracked genuine emotion, flickering across his weathered features. He reached out and gently took Tommy's outstretched hand. Hello, little one, he said softly. Are you ready to go home? Tommy nodded sleepily, then looked at Sarah. Can Grandpa Vito come too, Mommy? The innocent question hung in the air, laden with implications far beyond Tommy's understanding. Sarah looked from her son to Vittorio, seeing something she hadn't fully acknowledged before. The elderly mafioso had formed a genuine attachment to her child, an emotional investment that went beyond obligation or honor. Mr. Romano is very busy, sweetheart, she began cautiously. Vittorio interrupted gently. Actually, I would be honored to escort you home if your mother permits it. And so it was decided. As they prepared to leave the hospital, Agent Roberts appeared, his timing suggesting he had been monitoring their movements. The FBI agent had maintained a curious presence throughout Tommy's hospitalization, ostensibly continuing his investigation of the Romano family's unusual mobilization, but increasingly engaged in long conversations with Vittorio, their respective fathers' experiences, and the complicated moral landscape of loyalty and law. Mrs. Miller, he greeted her formally, then nodded to Vittorio with professional respect, rather than the adversarial stance of their first encounter. I understand you're being discharged today. Yes, Sarah replied, adjusting Tommy's coat. We're heading home. Roberts glanced at Vittorio, an unspoken communication passing between them. I'll be following up in a few days. There are still some questions about the events of that night that need resolution. Of course, Vittorio responded with equanimity. My door is always open to you, Agent Roberts. Sarah sensed a complex dynamic developing between these two men. Not friendship exactly, but a mutual recognition, perhaps even respect, born of shared connections to the past and current circumstances. The journey home revealed the first indication of how drastically her life had changed. A procession of 3 luxury vehicles awaited them at the hospital exit. Tommy, still weak but brightening at the prospect of riding in the gleaming black Mercedes, was carefully settled into a car seat that certainly hadn't been there when they departed for the hospital. As they drove through Detroit, Sarah noticed subtle changes in the city landscape. The storm had passed, leaving behind pristine snow that transformed even the most neglected neighborhoods into winter wonderlands. Yet there was something else, something in the way other drivers yielded to their small convoy, in the nods of recognition from certain pedestrians, in the general sense that they moved through the city under an invisible umbrella of protection. When they turned onto Maple Street, Sarah gasped audibly. The transformation was stunning. The empty lot that had long separated her house from her neighbors had been cleared of years of accumulated debris. Her small home, once visibly deteriorating among its more prosperous neighbors, now sported fresh paint, new windows, and a completely rebuilt front porch. The driveway, previously cracked and weed-infested, had been repaved, and a modest but immaculate sedan stood parked there. "What is that?" she asked, pointing to the car. "Transportation," Victoria replied simply, "for medical appointments, groceries, and other necessities." Sarah opened her mouth to protest, then closed it, remembering how the lack of transportation had nearly cost Tommy his life. Instead, she simply nodded, accepting this gift as she had accepted so many others in recent days, with a mixture of gratitude and trepidation about the unseen strings that might be attached. As they pulled up to her home, the front door opened and a group of people emerged. Sarah recognized some of the elderly men from the night of the snowstorm, but there were new faces too, including a distinguished woman in her 60s who carried herself with the same dignified assurance as Vittorio. "Allow me to introduce Sophia," Vittorio said as they exited the car. "My sister. She has overseen the renovations and preparations for your return." Sophia Romano approached with a warm smile that transformed her aristocratic features. She embraced Sarah as if they were old friends rather than strangers. "Your father was a hero to our family," she said, her accent slightly more pronounced than her brother's. "It is our honor to welcome you and young Tommy home." The interior of the house was unrecognizable. What had been a cramped, cold space with worn furnishings and peeling paint was now an elegant, comfortable home that somehow retained its modest character while incorporating quality materials and craftsmanship. The living room featured new furniture that was practical yet beautiful. The kitchen had been completely rebuilt with modern appliances but retained a welcoming warmth. Tommy's bedroom, previously non-existent, was a perfect space for a young boy with sturdy furniture, educational toys, and a medical-grade air purifier humming quietly in the corner. Throughout the tour, Sarah struggled to reconcile her feelings. On one hand, overwhelming gratitude for this transformation that would undoubtedly benefit Tommy's recovery and their quality of life. On the other, discomfort at such extensive changes made without her input and lingering questions about what the Romano family might eventually expect in return. Sophia seemed to sense her conflicted emotions. As the others busied themselves bringing in Tommy's things and preparing a light meal, she drew Sarah into the newly renovated kitchen. "You are wondering what all this means," Sophia said, her perceptiveness reminiscent of her brother's. "What comes next? What we expect from you?" Sarah nodded, appreciating the direct approach. "Yes, this is all incredible, but nothing comes without a price," Sophia finishes for her. "In most cases, that would be true. However, this situation is unique." She leaned against the new marble countertop, her expression serious. "My brother rarely speaks of the war. The memories are painful. But he has told me about your father, about the moment Joseph Miller made a choice that saved many lives, including Vittorio's." She paused, seeming to choose her next words carefully. "In our family and our tradition, such a debt is sacred. It passes through generations. It does not diminish with time." Her dark eyes, so similar to her brother's, held Sarah's gaze. "What has been done for you and Tommy is not charity, nor is it a transaction that requires repayment. It is simply the fulfillment of an obligation that has remained unpaid for too long." Before Sarah could respond, Tommy's voice called from the living room, excited about some new discovery. The moment passed, but Sophia's words lingered in Sarah's mind as they settled into their transformed home. The next morning brought another surprise. As Sarah prepared breakfast in the kitchen that still felt like it belonged to someone else, a knock came at the front door. Opening it, she found Frank Caruso on her porch, accompanied by three other men from Vittorio's inner circle. "Good morning, Mrs. Miller." Frank greeted her with his usual formal courtesy. "Don Vittorio sends his regards. He would like to discuss a business proposal with you, if you are feeling up to it. He suggests lunch at your convenience." Sarah hesitated. Tommy was still recovering, requiring frequent rest and careful monitoring. As if reading her thoughts, Frank added, Dr. Lorenzo would be happy to stay with Tommy while you're out. He believes the boy is progressing well, but could use a professional assessment today in any case. The thoughtfulness of the arrangement was typical of the Romano family's approach thus far, combining practical solutions with subtle pressure that made refusal difficult. Sarah found herself agreeing to lunch at noon, then watched as Dr. Lorenzo arrived precisely on schedule, medical bag in hand, settling into her living room with Tommy, as if he had been making house calls to Maple Street for years. Frank drove her to an upscale restaurant in downtown Detroit, one of those exclusive establishments with no sign on the door, and a maitre d' who seemed to recognize Frank immediately. They were ushered to a private dining room where Vittorio waited, rising politely as Sarah entered. The lunch that followed was extraordinary, not just for the impeccable food and service, but for the conversation. Vittorio, typically reserved, spoke at length about his life after how he had returned to a family business that was then primarily focused on neighborhood protection, local gambling, and traditional rackets. Times were different then, he explained, his tone matter of fact rather than apologetic. Italian Americans faced discrimination. Legal avenues for advancement were limited. The family provided what mainstream society denied us: economic opportunity, protection, a system of justice. He described how over decades he had gradually shifted the Romano empire toward legitimate businesses, hotels, restaurants, construction companies, real estate developments. The transition wasn't complete, he acknowledged, but each generation moved further from the old house into proper business practices. Which brings me to my proposal, he said finally as they finished their main course. Your father's fried chicken recipe. It's exceptional, truly unique. I believe it could be the foundation for a successful restaurant. Sarah blinked in surprise. Of all the possibilities she had imagined, this wasn't among them. A restaurant based on my father's recipe? Precisely. Located in your home initially. We would handle the conversion, licensing permits, everything. The front section would become Joseph's Kitchen, named for your father. The back would retain your private residence, suitably expanded and renovated. He laid out the business model with the precision of someone who had given it considerable thought. The Romano family would provide startup capital, handle regulatory hurdles, supply, initial staffing, and manage financial operations. Sarah would be the face of the restaurant, the keeper of her father's recipes, and eventually the full owner once the initial investment was recouped. You would have a sustainable income, meaningful work that honors your father's legacy, and Tommy would have stability and opportunities previously beyond reach. Vittorio concluded, the neighborhood would benefit from employment opportunities and economic revitalization, and I would have the satisfaction of knowing Joseph Miller's family is secure. The proposal was comprehensive, thoughtful, and extremely generous. Yet Sarah hesitated, sensing deeper currents beneath the surface. Mr. Romano, while I appreciate this opportunity more than I can express, I have to ask, why this particular business? Why my father's recipe? Vittorio studied her for a moment, respect flickering in his eyes at her perceptiveness. 3 reasons, he replied. First, practical economics. The recipe is genuinely exceptional and would distinguish the restaurant in a competitive market. Second, it honors your father in a tangible way that the community can appreciate. He paused, then added, and third, it provides legitimate cover for the Romano family's ongoing presence in your life. The honesty of this last admission surprised Sarah. Vittorio continued, his voice lower now. The truth, Mrs. Miller, is that once the Romano family extends protection to someone, it cannot be casually withdrawn. There are elements in my world who would see you and Tommy as leverage if they knew of my personal interest in your welfare. By establishing a business relationship that makes sense to outside observers, we create a narrative that explains our connection without revealing its true nature. Sarah considered his words carefully. So this restaurant would also be a way of explaining why Don Vittorio Romano takes a personal interest in a waitress and her son from Maple Street. Precisely, Vittorio acknowledged. Perception matters in my world. A clear business connection simplifies things. Their conversation was interrupted by Frank's discreet entrance. He bent to whisper something in Vittorio's ear, his expression giving nothing away. Vittorio's face, however, tightened almost imperceptibly. It seems we have an unexpected development, he said to Sarah. Your former husband has been making inquiries about you and Tommy, rather persistent inquiries. Sarah felt a chill run through her body. Greg, how would he even know about everything that's happened? The activities surrounding Tommy's illness were noticed. Local news covered the unusual procession to the hospital. Your name was mentioned. Vittorio's tone remained calm, but Sarah detected an undercurrent of controlled anger. He is currently at your home demanding to see his son. Sarah stood immediately, fear for Tommy overriding all other considerations. We need to go. Now. The drive back to Maple Street passed in tense silence. Sarah's mind raced through worst-case scenarios. Greg had been emotionally manipulative during their marriage and had shown no interest in Tommy after their separation, not even calling on their son's birthday. His sudden appearance now after all that had happened could only mean trouble. As they approached her house, Sarah saw Greg's battered pickup truck parked haphazardly in front of her home. On the porch, two elderly men in suits stood blocking the door, their posture relaxed but unmistakably resolute. Greg paced back and forth on her front lawn, gesticulating angrily. When he spotted the approaching Mercedes, Greg stormed toward it, his face contorted with a mixture of rage and calculation that Sarah recognized all too well from their worst arguments. As she exited the car, he closed the distance between them rapidly. Well, well, he sneered, looking from Sarah to Vittorio, who had emerged with deliberate calm from the other side of the vehicle. Didn't take you long to find yourself a sugar daddy, did it? And here I thought you were just a dried-up waitress nobody wanted. Sarah flinched at the verbal assault but stood her ground. What do you want, Greg? What do I want? He mimicked sarcastically. I want to see my son. I have rights, you know. And suddenly I hear all over town that my ex has a fancy new house, a new car, and some rich old Italian hanging around. Then I find out my kid was in the hospital and nobody bothered to call his father. His volume increased with each accusation, his face reddening. Sarah recognized the signs of escalating aggression, a pattern that had played out many times during their marriage. Tommy was very ill, she replied, trying to keep her voice steady. Everything happened quickly, and you haven't exactly been involved in his life since you left. Greg's expression twisted with malice. Yeah, well, things change. I'm thinking maybe it's time I took a more active role in my son's upbringing. Maybe even filed for custody since you obviously can't take proper care of him if he ended up in the hospital. The thinly veiled threat hit Sarah like a physical blow. Greg had never shown interest in being a father, but he had always excelled at identifying and exploiting her vulnerabilities. Before she could respond, Vittorio stepped forward. Despite being in his 70s and physically unimposing compared to Greg's bulky frame, his presence immediately commanded attention. Mr. Miller, he said, his voice quiet but carrying an authority that cut through Greg's bluster. I understand you are concerned about your son, a commendable sentiment if somewhat belated. However, your approach leaves much to be desired. Greg turned his attention to Vittorio, sizing him up with the instinctive calculation of someone accustomed to identifying weaknesses. And who the hell are you, old man? My business is with my wife and kid, not some geriatric boyfriend. Ex-wife, Sarah corrected automatically. Vittorio remained unperturbed by the insult. My name is Vittorio Romano. I am a business associate of Mrs. Miller and a friend of her family. I served with her father in the war. Something in Vittorio's calm demeanor seemed to penetrate Greg's anger, triggering a reassessment. The name Romano, clearly registered as a flicker of uncertainty, crossed his face. Romano? Like the Romano family? Greg's tone shifted, bravado mingled with new wariness. What's your business with Sarah? As I said, I am a business associate. Mrs. Miller and I are establishing a restaurant featuring her father's recipes, a legitimate enterprise that will provide for her and Tommy's future. This information clearly wasn't what Greg had expected. Sarah could almost see the calculations running behind his eyes, adjusting his approach to this new understanding of the situation. A restaurant here. He looked at the renovated house with fresh evaluation. Must be some recipe to get backing from the Romano family. His gaze returned to Sarah, narrowed with suspicion and opportunism. So that's your angle now. Got yourself connected with the mob. I wonder what the court would think about that when I file for custody. The threat hung in the air, its implications clear. Greg was willing to use Tommy as leverage to attempt extortion based on perceived connections to organized crime. Sarah felt sick at the familiar tactics, the emotional manipulation that had characterized their marriage, now directed at their son. Vittorio's expression didn't change, but the temperature of his voice dropped several degrees. Mr. Miller, I recommend you consider your next actions very carefully. Custody battles are expensive, emotionally draining, and rarely concluded quickly. They require steady employment, stable housing, and clean living on the part of the petitioner. His gaze flicked meaningfully to Greg's truck, where an open beer can was visible in the cup holder. They also tend to involve thorough background checks, financial audits, and character witnesses. Greg's face flushed darker, but a new calculation was clearly taking place behind his eyes. The implicit threat in Vittorio's words had registered. "Are you threatening me, old man?" "Not at all," Vittorio replied smoothly, "simply outlining the realities of family court proceedings. Now, if you wish to see your song, I suggest you return when you're sober during reasonable hours and with an approach more conducive to Tommy's well-being." For a moment, Greg seemed poised to escalate further. Then his gaze shifted to the porch where the two suited men still stood, impassively, and beyond them to several vehicles that had quietly appeared along Maple Street, each containing elderly men watching the scene with disciplined attention. The calculation complete, Greg took a step back, his expression morphing into a forced smile that didn't reach his eyes. "Fine. I'll come back another time. But this isn't over." He looked directly at Sarah. "I've got rights, and now that you've suddenly come into money, maybe we need to revisit that child support arrangement too." With that parting shot, he stalked to his truck, started it with an aggressive rev of the engine, and pulled away from the curb with squealing tires. Sarah watched him go, a familiar knot of anxiety forming in her stomach. "He'll be back," she said quietly. "And next time he'll have a lawyer or some kind of legal threat." Vittorio nodded, unsurprised. "Yes, he will, but he will find the legal system less accommodating to his ambitions than he imagines." The confidence in his statement should have been reassuring, but Sarah felt a renewed surge of discomfort at the implications. How exactly would the Romano family influence legal proceedings? What connections did they have within the court system? The moral complexities of accepting such protection weighed on her. Inside the house, they found Tommy napping peacefully under Dr. Lorenzo's watchful eye, blissfully unaware of the confrontation that had occurred. The doctor reported that Tommy's recovery was proceeding well, his lungs clearing steadily and his energy returning. After Dr. Lorenzo departed, Sarah found herself in the kitchen with Vittorio, the business proposal, and Greg's threats hanging between them like storm clouds. "I'll accept your offer about the restaurant," she said finally. "Not because of Greg's threats, but because it makes sense for Tommy's future, and because I believe my father would be proud to have his recipes shared this way." Vittorio nodded, a hint of satisfaction in his eyes. "A wise decision. We will begin preparations immediately." Sarah raised a hand, not quite finished. "But I need to understand something clearly. This connection to your family, this protection you're offering, it comes with certain realities that I'm not sure I fully comprehend yet. What happens when Tommy is older and asks questions about why men in suits sometimes watch our house? What happens when he's in school and other children talk about who his mother associates with?" These were questions that had troubled her throughout the whirlwind of recent days. The Romano family's support had quite literally saved Tommy's life and transformed their circumstances, but it also tied them to a world with its own complex moral code and potential dangers. Vittorio considered her questions with the gravity they deserved. "These are valid concerns. The truth is, Mrs. Miller, that any association with my family carries both benefits and complications. I cannot promise that there will never be moments that require careful navigation or difficult explanations." He moved to the window, looking out at Maple Street with its neat houses and ordinary appearance. "What I can promise is that my protection includes safeguarding Tommy from any negative consequences of our connection. As he grows, we will find age-appropriate ways to help him understand the complexities of loyalty, honor, and the sometimes gray areas of human morality." He turned back to face her. "Many successful, respectable families in this city have historical connections to mine. Their children attend the finest universities, enter prestigious professions, lead exemplary lives. The path forward need not be defined by outdated stereotypes or simplified moral judgments." His words were eloquent and reassuring, yet Sarah sensed he was offering a particular perspective that reflected his own values and experiences. The full reality would likely be more complicated. "I appreciate your honesty," she said finally. "I think we can make this work for Tommy's sake and to honor my father's memory." But I need to maintain certain boundaries, certain principles that I can teach Tommy without compromise. Vittorio inclined his head in acknowledgement. Of course, I would expect nothing less from Joseph Miller's daughter. The conversation was interrupted by Tommy's sleepy voice calling from the living room. Sarah went to him, finding him sitting up on the sofa, his eyes bright with improving health. "Mommy, I'm hungry," he announced. "Can we have chicken, like Grandpa's recipe?" Sarah smiled, struck by the simple request that now carried so much significance. "Yes, sweetheart. I think that's a perfect idea." 6 months passed with remarkable speed, transforming both Maple Street and the lives of its residents. Joseph's Kitchen had opened to immediate success, drawing customers first out of curiosity about the unusual partnership between a former waitress and the Romano family, then returning for the extraordinary food that centered around Joseph Miller's secret fried chicken recipe. The renovation had been completed with impressive efficiency, converting the front portion of Sarah's home into the warm, inviting restaurant while expanding the living quarters in the back for Sarah and Tommy. The kitchen was now a professional setup where Sarah worked alongside Angelo, a former five-star chef who had retired from the Romano family's flagship restaurant in Chicago to help train Sarah in the finer points of restaurant management. On this particular evening, Sarah stood at the entrance of the packed dining room, watching as customers from all walks of Detroit life enjoyed her father's recipes. Businessmen in suits sat alongside blue-collar workers, elderly couples beside young families, all united by the simple pleasure of exceptional comfort food. Martha Wilson occupied a corner table with several other neighbors who had once treated Sarah with suspicion or outright hostility. Now they were regular customers, Martha herself having undergone the most dramatic transformation from vocal critic to enthusiastic supporter. The elderly woman caught Sarah's eye and raised her glass in acknowledgement, a gesture that still surprised Sarah despite its increasing frequency. "Quite a change from 6 months ago," said a familiar voice beside her. Sarah turned to find Agent Daniel Roberts' FBI badge discreetly tucked into his jacket pocket, surveying the scene with professional interest but undisguised approval. "Agent Roberts," she greeted him. "I didn't expect to see you tonight." "Just checking in," he replied easily. "Part of our agreement with Don Romano. Regular oversight of the business to ensure everything remains above board." The agreement he referenced had been one of the most unexpected developments of the past months. Following their confrontation outside her home, Greg had indeed returned with legal threats, filing for both custody of Tommy and increased child support. The case had seemed destined for an ugly, protracted battle until Agent Roberts had intervened in a most unusual way. Using his position with the FBI, Roberts had offered Vittorio a deal in exchange for the Romano family transitioning completely to legitimate businesses within Detroit. The Bureau would provide certain protections, including keeping official distance from Joseph's Kitchen, provided it operated with full transparency. Part of that arrangement had apparently included addressing Greg's legal maneuverings through entirely legitimate but remarkably effective channels. "Is Don Vittorio joining us tonight?" Roberts asked, glancing around the restaurant. "I have some paperwork he'll want to see regarding the expansion permits." The proposed expansion of Joseph's Kitchen into a second location downtown had been Vittorio's idea, part of his accelerated timeline for legitimate business development. The speed with which permits and approvals had been obtained spoke volumes about the Romano family's influence, even when operating within legal boundaries. "He should be here shortly," Sarah replied. "He never misses Friday nights. Tommy expects their chess game." As if summoned by her words, the front door opened and Vittorio Romano entered, accompanied as always by Frank and two other associates. Despite the advancing months in his ongoing health issues, which he refused to discuss, but which Sarah had learned about from Sofia, Vittorio maintained his impeccable appearance and dignified bearing. The restaurant fell momentarily quiet as he entered, then resumed its convivial atmosphere with a subtle shift that fascinated Sarah. It wasn't fear that his presence inspired, but a kind of respectful deference, an acknowledgement of status that transcended his connection to the Mafia. Even Agent Roberts straightened slightly as Vittorio approached. "Mrs. Miller," Vittorio greeted her formally, though his eyes held the warmth that emerged only around Sarah and Tommy. "Agent Roberts, I trust the evening finds you both well." Before either could respond, a small figure darted from the back of the restaurant, weaving between tables with the energy of a fully recovered and increasingly confident 4-year-old. Grandpa Vito, Tommy called out, launching himself into Vittorio's waiting arms. I've been practicing the chess moves you showed me. Vittorio lifted the boy with surprising strength for his age, his usually reserved expression transforming into genuine delight. Have you now? Perhaps you'll finally beat me tonight, Campione. The relationship between Tommy and Vittorio had deepened over the months, evolving into something that resembled a true grandfather-grandson bond. Sarah had watched with a mixture of gratitude and caution as her son formed attachments to various members of the Romano family. Sophia, who brought him books and taught him Italian phrases. Frank, who sometimes took him for drives in the countryside. And especially Vittorio, who treated the boy with a tenderness that seemed to surprise even his closest associates. As Vittorio carried Tommy to their usual corner table for their weekly chess match, Sarah noticed Agent Roberts watching them with an expression she couldn't quite decipher. "Sometimes I forget who he really is," Roberts said quietly. "When I see him with your son, he's just a grandfather, not—" He trailed off, leaving the thought unfinished. "I know," Sarah replied. "I struggle with it too. The man who reads Italian fairy tales to Tommy at bedtime is hard to reconcile with other aspects of his life." Roberts nodded thoughtfully. "The world isn't always black and white, Mrs. Miller. Sometimes good people do questionable things, and sometimes those we might label as criminals are capable of extraordinary decency." His philosophical turn surprised her. "Is that the FBI's official position these days?" A smile flickered across his serious face. "Hardly, but it's increasingly mine, at least regarding the Romano situation." Their conversation was interrupted by the arrival of an unexpected visitor. Greg Miller stood in the doorway, his appearance markedly different from their last encounter. Gone was the disheveled, aggressive ex-husband. In his place stood a clean-shaven, soberly dressed man who surveyed the restaurant with evident discomfort. Sarah tensed immediately, but Roberts placed a reassuring hand on her arm. "It's all right, he's expected." "Expected," Sarah's alarm grew. "What do you mean, part of the final resolution?" Roberts explained cryptically. "Don Romano and I arranged this meeting. It's time to close that chapter permanently." Before Sarah could demand further explanation, Vittorio rose from his chess game with Tommy and approached Greg with the deliberate calm that characterized all his important interactions. Frank materialized at Greg's side gently but firmly, guiding him toward a private room at the back of the restaurant. "What's happening?" Sarah asked Roberts, unable to hide her concern. "A clean ending," the FBI agent replied. "Legally binding and permanently enforceable. By tomorrow, Greg Miller will have signed away all parental rights in exchange for certain financial considerations, and he will have agreed to relocate permanently to Arizona, where a job mysteriously awaits him." Sarah stared at him. "You arranged this, the FBI." Roberts looked slightly uncomfortable. "Let's say it's a collaborative effort between federal resources and Don Romano's connections, all strictly within legal boundaries. Sometimes the law needs creative applications to achieve true justice." The meeting lasted less than 30 minutes. When it concluded, Greg emerged from the private room looking subdued but somehow relieved. He glanced once at Tommy, still engrossed in his chess game, then at Sarah, giving her a brief nod that contained neither apology nor animosity, merely acceptance. Without another word, he left the restaurant, climbed into a taxi waiting outside, and disappeared from their lives. Vittorio and Frank returned to the main dining room, the elderly Don resuming his game with Tommy as if nothing unusual had occurred. Only the subtle nod he exchanged with Agent Roberts indicated the significance of what had just transpired. Later that night, after the restaurant had closed and Tommy was asleep, Sarah sat with Vittorio and Roberts on the small patio behind the restaurant. The summer evening was warm, the sky clear, a peaceful contrast to the cold, stormy night when their unlikely alliance had begun. "It's official then," Sarah said, still processing the evening's events. "Greg has gone for good." "Yes," Vittorio confirmed. "The papers are signed, notarized, and filed with multiple agencies. He has relinquished all claims to Tommy in perpetuity and agreed to the relocation terms. The monthly stipend he will receive is generous enough to ensure his compliance." Sarah should have felt only relief, but the methodical efficiency with which Tommy's father had been removed from their lives, regardless of his past failures, left her with complicated emotions. "Was this really necessary?" she asked. "He was hardly involved in Tommy's life anyway." "Loose ends are dangerous," Vittorio said simply. Your ex-husband represented an unpredictable variable, a potential threat to Tommy's security and your peace of mind. Now that threat is permanently neutralized through entirely legal means. He glanced at Roberts, who nodded confirmation. Every step was documented and properly executed, the FBI agent assured her. Your son is protected, and Mr. Miller has been given an opportunity for a fresh start far from here. It's a resolution that serves everyone's interests. Sarah wasn't entirely convinced, but she recognized the pragmatic wisdom in their approach. With Greg gone, one significant source of anxiety had been removed from her life. Tommy would grow up without the emotional complications of a father who appeared and disappeared unpredictably, making demands without offering stability. There's something else we need to discuss, Vittorio said after a moment, his tone shifting subtly. My health. Sarah had suspected for months that the elderly Don was concealing something serious. His occasional winces when lifting Tommy, the medication she had glimpsed in his pocket, the whispered consultations with Dr. Lorenzo, all pointed to a condition more grave than the minor issues he dismissed whenever she inquired. How bad is it? She asked directly. Terminal, Vittorio replied with the same matter-of-fact tone he might use to discuss the weather. Cardiac complications exacerbated by old injuries. The specialists give me perhaps a year at most. The news hit Sarah with unexpected force. Despite the complicated nature of their relationship, Vittorio had become a constant in her life, a protective presence whose commitment to her and Tommy had never wavered. The thought of his absence created an emptiness she hadn't anticipated. Does Tommy know, she asked, thinking of her son's attachment to his Grandpa Vito. No, and I would prefer to keep it that way for now, Vittorio said. Children should be protected from such concerns for as long as possible. Agent Roberts cleared his throat, clearly uncomfortable with the personal turn of the conversation. Don Romano has been working with us to accelerate the family's transition to legitimate businesses. It's been impressive the speed with which he's dismantled certain operations. Sarah understood the subtext. Vittorio was racing against time to transform his organization before his death, to leave behind a legacy that honored the promise he had made to her father 50 years ago. What will happen to Joseph's Kitchen? She asked. To us, Vittorio smiled slightly. Everything has been arranged. The restaurant will belong entirely to you, free and clear of any investment obligations. A trust has been established for Tommy's education and future needs. Sophia will continue as your advisor for as long as you wish. Frank will oversee security matters discreetly. He paused, then added, and Agent Roberts has agreed to serve as an unofficial guardian of sorts, ensuring that no future administrations at the Bureau disturb the arrangements we've made. Roberts nodded confirmation. It's unusual, but this entire situation is unprecedented. The Romano family's voluntary transformation deserves appropriate recognition and protection. Sarah looked between these two men so different in background and profession, yet united in their commitment to honoring Joseph Miller's legacy through his daughter and grandson. The complicated moral questions remained, but they were increasingly overshadowed by the undeniable good that had emerged from this unlikely alliance. 1 year later, Joseph's Kitchen had expanded to 3 locations across Detroit, each featuring the legendary fried chicken that had become a symbol of the city's revitalization. Sarah now oversaw a growing business empire that employed dozens of people, many from formerly struggling neighborhoods similar to where she had once lived. Tommy, now 5, had started kindergarten, thriving academically and socially. The once shy, sickly boy had blossomed into a confident child whose favorite activities included chess, taught by Vittorio, cooking, a natural talent inherited from his grandfather Joseph, and telling stories to anyone who would listen about his extended family. The transformation of Maple Street had been equally remarkable. What had once been a divided neighborhood marked by suspicion and isolation had become a community united by the unlikely catalyst of Joseph's Kitchen. Martha Wilson now managed the original location, her formidable organizational skills having found perfect expression in restaurant administration. Other neighbors had found employment or investment opportunities in the expanding business, their former prejudices dissolving in the face of mutual prosperity. On this particular evening, a special gathering had been arranged in the private dining room of the downtown location. The occasion was solemn but not unexpected. Don Vittorio Romano had passed away 3 days earlier, his heart finally surrendering after exceeding the doctor's predictions by nearly 6 months. The room contained an unusual assembly, Romano family members, FBI agents, including Daniel Roberts, city officials, community leaders, and, at the center, Sarah and Tommy. The traditional barriers between law enforcement, organized crime, and civilian society had temporarily dissolved in recognition of the extraordinary transformation Vittorio had orchestrated in his final years. Mayor Thompson, whose election had been quietly supported by both the Romano family and federal authorities, raised his glass. To Vittorio Romano, whose vision for a legitimate family business legacy has created jobs, revitalized neighborhoods, and demonstrated that second acts are indeed possible in American life. As glasses were raised around the room, Sarah noticed Tommy watching the proceedings with solemn attention. He had taken the news of Vittorio's passing with surprising maturity, declaring that Grandpa Vito has gone to meet my real grandpa in heaven, and they're probably playing chess together. After the official tributes concluded and guests began to depart, Sarah found herself standing with Frank Sophia and Agent Roberts beside a large photograph of Vittorio that had been placed on an easel. In the image, the elderly Don sat at a chess table with Tommy, both intent on the board between them, neither looking at the camera. It captured perfectly the bond that had formed between them, transcending the complicated circumstances of their connection. He left instructions, Sophia said, breaking the contemplative silence, about the future of the family, about Joseph's kitchen, about Tommy's education, everything meticulously planned as always. Frank nodded. The transition will continue exactly as he outlined. The legitimate businesses will expand, the other operations will be systematically dismantled. His last orders were very specific. And the FBI will honor its commitments, Roberts added. The agreement stands regardless of who sits in my office in the future. I've made certain of that. Sarah listened to these assurances with gratitude, but also a growing sense of her own authority. In the years since learning of Vittorio's illness, she had gradually assumed more responsibility, not just for the restaurants, but for navigating the complex web of relationships that surrounded them. She was no longer the desperate waitress, grateful for any help, but a business owner and community leader in her own right. I appreciate everything you've all done, she said. But moving forward, I think it's important that Tommy and I forge our own path. The restaurant will always honor its origins, my father's recipe, Vittorio's investment, the Romano family's support, but its future belongs to the next generation. Her gentle assertion of independence might once have been met with resistance from Vittorio's lieutenants. Instead, Frank and Sophia exchanged glances that contained both respect and approval. Don Vittorio predicted this moment, Sophia said with a hint of pride. He said Joseph Miller's daughter would eventually claim her own destiny, as she should. The conversation was interrupted by Tommy, who approached with the confident stride of a child secure in his place within this unusual gathering. Mom, he said, taking Sarah's hand, can I show everyone something? With her permission, Tommy climbed onto a chair, gaining the attention of the remaining guests. From his pocket, he withdrew a small worn card, the original recipe for Joseph Miller's fried chicken, written in his grandmother's careful handwriting. My grandpa Joseph wrote this recipe, Tommy announced with the solemnity of a child entrusted with an important legacy. He saved Grandpa Vito in the war, and then Grandpa Vito saved me when I was sick. And now we have our restaurant to remember them both. The simplicity of his summary brought unexpected tears to Sarah's eyes. Tommy had distilled the complex, sometimes morally ambiguous story of their journey into its essential truth, a cycle of salvation, sacrifice, and legacy that transcended conventional boundaries. Later that night, as Sarah tucked Tommy into bed in their home above the original restaurant on Maple Street, he asked a question that revealed his growing understanding of their unusual circumstances. Mom, are we part of the Romano family now? Billy at school said his dad told him we are. Sarah considered her answer carefully. We're connected to the Romano family through friendship and history. Grandpa Vito considered us family because of what your Grandpa Joseph did for him many years ago. But we're the Miller family with our own special legacy. Tommy nodded, processing this distinction. So we have two families, the Millers and the Romanos. In a way, Sarah acknowledged, family isn't always just the people who share your last name. Sometimes it's the people who stand by you when you need them most, who honor their promises even when it's difficult. Tommy seemed satisfied with this explanation. As he drifted towards sleep, he murmured, I'm going to make my own restaurant someday, with Grandpa's chicken and new recipes too. I believe you will, Sarah said softly, stroking his hair. Outside the window, Maple Street lay peaceful under the summer stars, transformed from the isolated, suspicious neighborhood it had once been. Inside Joseph's kitchen below, the final customers of the evening enjoyed meals prepared according to recipes that connected past to present. And throughout Detroit, the ripples of an unlikely alliance between a waitress and an elderly mafia don continued to spread, creating opportunities, building communities, and honoring a 50-year-old debt that had ultimately been paid in full. Sarah Miller, once desperate and alone, now stood at the center of a legacy that bridged generations, cultures, and the sometimes arbitrary boundaries between right and wrong. In the end, the simple act of opening her door on a stormy night to 25 elderly men had launched a transformation greater than she could have imagined, proof that sometimes salvation came in the most unexpected forms, and that honor once pledged could echo through decades to change not just individual lives, but entire communities. The recipe box that had once seemed like a sentimental keepsake now sat proudly displayed in the restaurant's entrance, a testament to Joseph Miller's legacy and the extraordinary chain of events his heroism had set in motion. Beside it, a newer addition, a chessboard permanently arranged in the middle of the game Vittorio and Tommy had been playing on their final evening together, a reminder that some bonds transcend even death, and that the most powerful legacies are those built on promises kept.